Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you to the Day 2 proceedings of the 15th All India Conference of China Studies, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, in cooperation with Guwahati University and Omio Kumar Das Institute of Social Change and Development, in partnership with the India Office Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This is the second special panel, and the theme of this panel is Institutional Interfaces and Informal Histories in the Himalayan Contact Zone. We are honored to have Professor Mahendra P. Lama as the chair for this session. Dr. Lama is a professor at the Center for South Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and a former Vice-Chancellor of Sikkim University, Gangtok. We have a prolific line of speakers for this session. Our first speaker will be Dr. Swati Chawla, Associate Professor of History, Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities, OP Jindal Global University. She will deliver her talk on the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology and Sikkim's resistance to merger with India. Our second speaker is Dr. Aniket Alam, Associate Professor, Human Sciences Research Group, Center for Exact Humanities, IIIT-Hyderabad. He will speak on the oral histories of border making in the Western Himalayas in the 20th century. Our third speaker will be Dr. Sanjukta Datta, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Ashoka University, Sonipat. She will deliver her talk Across the Himalayas, Magadha's Buddhist Networks. Our last speaker would be Dr. Swargjyoti Guhen, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Ashoka University, Sonipat. She will speak on institutional networks and the forging of Indian Himalayan solidarity. You can find the detailed bios of all the speakers and our respected chair in the brochure provided in the chat box. Now, before I invite Professor Lama to begin the proceedings, let me lay out a few housekeeping rules. All participants except the speaker will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. Since this is the first session of the day, I would also request the speakers to restrict their talk to 15 to 18 minutes. We will be giving a reminder when the 15-minute mark is up. I'll now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Nishant. I think we are going to have a very interesting session today. We'll be basically discussing on institutional interfaces and informal histories in the Himalayas. So we will be bringing the history part of it, the evolution part of it, the interfaces part of it, interconnections, and of course, the present issues. A very interesting theme. Before I invite the first speaker, Professor Swati Chawla, let me point out from my view what are the emerging issues in the mountain areas and what really happened as far as institutions are concerned. I think the mountain areas used to be one of the most integrated geographies as far as ecologies are concerned, culture, economic integrations part, the natural resource management, right? And of course, the institutions and the knowledge sharing. And a major dislocation came into being when the nation states started very clearly distinguishing between border and borderlands. Till then, it was just a borderland. People used to communicate, communities exchanged views, natural resources were exchanged, right? Everything was so natural. Trade happened, tourism happened, pilgrimage happened, all the things happened. So it was something like a mountain port. The global world came, interacted, right, exchanged And of course, institutions were set up, both formal and informal. The moment the nation states started reasserting their geographies, these borderlands became what you call today as borders. And so it became a geometric line from a geographical space, community, cultural space. And the moment it happened, or it took the kind of a very unorthodox turn of a geometric line, then all the national security concerns came into being. So everything was dislocated, communities to trade, to pilgrimage, to natural resource management, everything was dislocated. And I'm sure we are today again trying to say, going back to say borderlands, right? And we are saying that, okay, if you have a concerns as far as national security is concerned, where does the national security and culture meet? Where does trade, national security ends and the trade begins, right? Such kind of things we are discussing. And there's a vast literature which is coming up. The second issue, which is very interesting in the mountain areas, is, you know, the mountain areas actually became a kind of a bastion of resource transfer. All the resources were transferred from the highlands to the lowlands, right? And more importantly, the cream of development, what we call in economics multiplier, it was siphoned away to places like what you call is Delhi, to places like London, to places like anything. If you see, all the things were siphoned. As a result of which, the cream of development actually did not remain in the mountain areas, right? And large scale, what you call it, migrations within the country, outside the country happened, and on a cross-border basis. And that was, that really brought about tremendous degree and a new variety of what you call human insecurities. And that included energy, environment, water, all kinds of insecurities. That's why you find many of the mountain areas today talking about or resorting to what you call resource subnationalism, right? That means they are so particular about not giving away their resources so easily. And that you can see from the Tibetan perspectives, from the Nepalese perspectives, and a country like even Myanmar, Bhutan, and some parts of Pakistan. The third issue which I would like to highlight is there's a new variety of interconnecting initiatives. I personally call it Trishul approach, particularly adopted by China, right? You have, when China enters into South Asia or Southeast Asia or Central Asia, it essentially says, okay, let me have three different strategies. First, of course, is I will go purely as a kind of a local integrations as far as the strategies are concerned. Secondly, a national integration. Thirdly, a regional integration. So you have Beijing and Delhi, Beijing and Kathmandu, Beijing and all kinds of capitals, including Islamabad, right? Then you have a regionalism. You have Southeast ASEAN, you have BIMSTEC, you have SAARC, all kinds of. And the third very critical thing, which is of primary interest to all of us in the mountain areas, is local integrations. You'll find China integrating Afghanistan through Wakhan Corridor, India through Nathula, Jalepla, Shipkila, all right, and of course Lipu Lake, then with Nepal through Raswagandhi to Raswagari to Jangmu to Mustang to Oland, what you call it, Lama Burger to, and Pakistan Kunjara Pass. Very interesting. And all these local integrations are just for the namesake, they are locals. But actually they are getting tightly integrated with what you call the national highways, expressways, national grid, energy grid, all kinds of things. So this is something which is very new as far as mountain regions are concerned, and this is bringing a newer variety of technology, institutions, knowledge, resources, strategy, criticality, right? And the fourth factor I would like to highlight is, of course, the impact of climate change. You can see all over the mountain areas today, the what you call the transborder phenomenon of transborder environmental injuries, right? You can see pandemics to floods to what your gin piracy to all kinds of things very, very, very rapidly and very, very widely happening, right? And earlier there were institutions that really took care of it. Today we don't find not many institutions located in the mountain areas to do this. You see, look at, I'm sure at least one of the panel members would discuss about what has happened to water resources. When I traveled from Lhasa to Ganse, then to Sigatse, then to Saga, then Tunche, then to Nori, I found the entire stretch of Yarlung Sangpo and Indus, getting really, the tributaries are really getting dried up. And everybody's talking about high dams in the mountain areas. I see Chinese doing such a lot of work to divert the rivers, right? In China, I see our own state, Arunachal Pradesh, widely talking about harnessing resources, tidal resources, Sikkim, right? But I would feel that there is a very, very serious danger because of the climate change, right? There are issues related to glacial lake outburst, flood. Studies are done by the scientific communities, but the communities which really get the real brunt of it still do not know what is real, what is happening as far as climate change is concerned. So you have diverse changes. So I'm sure we are going to discuss some of these issues in this very widely known panelist by the widely known panelists today. And I think the first speaker would be Professor Swati Chawla from the OP Jindal University in Sonipat. Professor Chawla.
Thank you, and thanks for those opening remarks. Really sets the stage very well for our deliberations. And thank you, Swargajyoti, for organizing this panel, and to the ICS, especially Professor Shabri Mitra, for inviting us. For a South Asianist like myself, it is always a pleasure to speak at an ICS conference and meet scholars I wouldn't otherwise interact with. Thank you also, Nishant and Professor Lama, for shepherding us in this session. So the paper that I'm presenting today is part of two new projects on institutions that house Tibetan studies, broadly speaking, Tibetan studies broadly speaking in India. With Swargajyoti in part, and also with Madhura Balasubramaniam at IIT Chennai, who's here with us today. I have been studying the histories of Tibetology institutes or departments, their curricula, the faculty and student research that they support, the linguistic training that they are able to provide to their students or not able to in some cases, their geographical focus, so Tibet or Eastern, Western Himalaya, and disciplinary base, IR, anthropology, history, sociology, geography. It's great also to have Aniket on the panel today, who was among the scholars who we consulted on this project. And the second related research is on the significant contributions of the Tibetan community in exile in India in building these institutions that have revitalized the study of Tibet and Himalaya in India. On 28 January 2021, many of us might recall just last year or now almost 2 years ago, as Indian and Chinese troops faced off in Ladakh in the Western Himalaya, the Times of India at the time reported about the Indian Army's proposal for its officers to study Tibetology. Now, this proposed course of study included Tibetan history, culture, and language on both sides of the line of actual control and the international boundary. It aimed to, I'm quoting, counter the propaganda and spread of influence by China by equipping Indian Army officers with better knowledge about Tibet. The move was a welcome step forward, and Madhura Balasubramaniam and I had written an op-ed at the time for the Hindu about this. And we said it was a welcome step forward since India-China relations cannot be approached through a strictly bilateral prism that left Tibet and Himalaya out. However, even as the proposal recognized the importance of building expertise on Tibet and sending its officers to these institutions, its conceptualization of what Tibetology was, to our mind at the time, fell short in three critical ways. First, it approached the study of Tibet only as a means to the strategic end of better preparedness in taking on the Chinese threat. Relatedly, it did not acknowledge the long linkages among Tibetan parts of Himalayan India, such as Ladakh, Sikkim, and Tawang, which have all been sites of Sino-Indian tensions in recent years. And also, I think what Professor Lama was alerting us to when he talked about this transition from thinking about the borderlands within the nation state framework and the violence it does to our understanding. Third, the choice of institutes betrayed the identification of Tibetology with Buddhism. But this proposal by the Indian Army, they weren't the first to conflate Tibetology and Buddhism. In fact, Tibetan studies across the world have focused heavily on Buddhism, primarily, and then also on the border issue between India and China. So the Indian Army Training Command, track, identified 7 institutes in India where officers could enroll for training in Tibetology. 2 of these, the School of Buddhist Philosophy in Leh, Ladakh, which is now known as the Central Institute of Buddhist Studies, and the Central Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies, or CIHTS, in Sarnath, which I think Swargjyoti will tell us more about, were established in the early institution building years after independence and focused on the study of Buddhism. A third, the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology in Sikkim, which is the focus of this paper, was inaugurated by Prime Minister Nehru in 1958. And the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, had laid its foundation the previous year on his way back from India for the 2500th Buddha Jayanti celebrations. This is, of course, before the Dalai Lama came into exile in 1959. Nehru had also suggested to Foreign Secretary Subimal Dutt, who served from 1955 to 61, that the CIHTS at Sarnath be run almost entirely by the Tibetan monks who had followed the 14th Dalai Lama into exile. The Tibetan exile community has since shepherded the institution. Also on the list was the Dalai Lama Institute for Higher Education in Bangalore, which was established for Tibetans in exile as part of the Tibetan Children's Village under the exile administration. In addition to these institutions, the Tibetan community has rebuilt several important Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in various Tibetan settlements in India. And these monasteries welcome monks from the Himalayan states in India into their order, and have also served as pedagogic nodes for extending, imparting, and preserving Tibetan Buddhism within India. And again, I know Swargjyoti will talk more about the monasteries. But the role of the Tibetan exile community in nurturing the study of Tibetan Himalaya is often unacknowledged, and something our collective work tries to redress. The instrumental and strategic employment of Tibetology as a counter to China is not very different from how the Tibet and the Himalaya have been approached in most scholarship. The production and codification of knowledge about Tibet had served imperial geopolitical interests from the earliest missionary writings to subsequent travelogues, journalistic writing, and histories written by diplomats who were posted in the region. But in defining Tibetology so narrowly, we miss the opportunity, I argue, to understand post-colonial India, which did not become the nation state that we, and this is not news to anybody in this room, but still bears reminding that it did not become the state that we see on maps today on 15th August 1947, nor, as Aniket's book argued so persuasively, were the mountains and plains of India integrated into a single nation state uniformly or simultaneously. The Indian Union was painstakingly welded together for decades before and after independence, a process that involved the consolidation of territory, the cultivation of a citizenry, and the creation and sustenance of nationalist narratives through iconography, through speeches, song, film, writing. The Namgyal Institute of Tibetology is part of this history of the forging of the Indian Republic. Now, in 1946, as the cabinet mission proceedings were on, negotiating the shape that India was going to take post the withdrawal of the British, in protracted negotiations, the last two monarchs of Sikkim, along with their counterparts from Bhutan, asserted that their kingdom was unlike any of the other 600 or 500 odd princely states that was slowly getting folded into India or Pakistan by virtue of its Buddhist faith. The others, they said, were either Hindu or Muslim. In cartographic, religious, and cultural narratives, the Sikkimese monarchy stressed that their kingdom's affinity was with Lhasa and the institution of the Dalai Lama. However, even after independence and the signing of the Indo-Sikkimese Treaty of Friendship in 1950, the Sikkim Darbar remained anxious about the possibility of incorporation into India and made efforts to highlight Sikkim's separate political, religious, and cultural identity. And the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology plays a part in this assertion. Established in 1948, as I mentioned, the Tibetology Institute, based in Gangtok, housed Tibetan Buddhist art and iconography, both of which were deployed to cement Sikkim's assertion of difference from India. The NIT served as a locus of Sikkimese diplomacy and a symbol of its Buddhist character by placing the kingdom within the Tibetan cultural region and away from British and post-colonial India. It holds among the world's largest collections of Tibetan religious art, statues, manuscripts, and ritual objects outside of Tibet. Chogyal Tashi Namgyal, who reigned from 1914 to 63, donated the land for the institute, and as I mentioned before, the foundation was laid by the Dalai Lama. Tashi Namgyal's son, Palden Thondup Namgyal, who was the last Chogyal of Sikkim, was the founding president of the NIT. He had also served as president of the Mahabodhi Society of India. NIT's telling of the history of Sikkim foregrounds its connection with Tibet and with Tibetan Buddhism, most importantly through images of the 8th century Tantric master, Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche, credited with the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet and Sikkim, and the 3 lamas who assisted the first king, Phuntsok Namgyal, in proselytizing the Lepchas into Buddhism in the 17th century. The efforts to establish an institute of Tibetology were coterminous with the Sikkim Darbar's adoption of traditional Buddhist titles of Chogyal, which means Dharma king, and Gemo, or for the queen. The former had actually been styled as Maharaja, and his son, the last Chogyal, as Maharaj Kumar in the colonial administration. But then post-independence, they shed these, to their mind, Sanskritic titles in favor of Chogyal and Gemo. they attempted to resist Indian incorporation by shifting the locus of legitimacy and authority from Delhi to Lhasa, from Hindu or Indian to Buddhist or Sikkimese, and its articulation from Sanskrit to Tibetan. Now, I know I'm at 12 minutes already, so just two instances from the archival record about how the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology played this role in asserting Sikkim's difference from India. So the first is a report by Nari Rustamji, who had been posted to Sikkim as a Government of India appointee, and also was batchmates with the Chogyal in 1941 at the Indian Civil Services training camp and had been friends with the Chogyal. In his report to the Government of India in 1954, this is housed at the Teen Murti in his private papers, he says that if the Sikkimese people were going to be convinced that India meant to stand by the Indo-Sikkimese treaty and not merely to maneuver things towards the ultimate takeover of state, then the entire atmosphere would be altered, and India needed to reassure the Sikkimese people that it did not have, it did not mean to take over the state. And towards this, Rustamji says that there was a need for allaying the apprehension of the Bhutias and Lepchas that their culture was in the danger of being eroded away. And the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology could play a role, and India's support for it, and as I mentioned, Nehru inaugurated it, and the Government of India provided some funding for this, could help in allaying those apprehensions. So he also reminds India that with Chinese entry into Tibet, Tibetan refugees who had come in had salvaged historical, religious, literary, and scientific texts from Tibetan monastic libraries and had made them over to the NIT. It was founded for promotion of Tibetan studies in various branches of learning and eventually inaugurated under the joint auspices of the Dalai Lama and India's Prime Minister, which in Rustamji's understanding was an assurance to Sikkim's minorities of India's rejection of the traditional policy of turning Sikkim away from Tibetan influence. So this is the old colonial policy of making sure that Sikkim, Bhutan, and these areas which were called India's Mongolian fringe stayed in the Indian orbit of influence, so to turn them away from northern influence. So the joint inauguration by the Dalai Lama and Nehru could help allay that fear. Also, India was providing financial support for annual religious dances at various monasteries in Sikkim, which in turn was, to reassure the Sikkimese people that that this wasn't sort of laying the groundwork for the eventual takeover of the state. The second is in 1966, the Gemo, or the Chogyal's wife, Hope Cook, in an article in the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology's bulletin, raised a minor storm actually in India on the ground that it offended, in India's mind, the article offended against the Indo-Sikkim Treaty of 1950 because she claimed that the transfer of Darjeeling to the British in 1835 had been illegal, and that Sikkim theoretically still retained sovereignty over the territory. So the argument that the Gemo made, and I know I'm actually at over 15 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up in a minute. The argument that she made was that under the Sikkimese theory of landholding, which maintained that all land belonged to the king and only the right of use or use of frontage was transferred, not ownership. So India, of course, was enraged. There were questions asked in parliament, and the political officer in Sikkim reported back to the Government of India that the Institute of Tibetology, which according to its charter was an autonomous body, had received substantial funding from the Government of India, and so by implication shouldn't be supporting or publishing articles like this, and that the editorial board consisted of the Gemo herself, the secretary of the establishment and ecclesiastical department of the Government of Sikkim, and Sri Nirmal Sinha, who was the director of the Tibetology Institute. So just to wind up, we are talking about institutional histories. So this is just one example of one institution, in one Himalayan state, and its role in this larger narrative of where do these states, what is their relationship going to be with India? And where do they belong? And what's their relationship going to be with Tibet post 1959? So it's just an attempt to, present that snippet of history and to link it to the larger history of institutions of Tibetology supported by the Tibetan government in exile. So that's, that part I didn't really get to come to, but I'll be happy to answer questions. So thank you.
Professor Lama,
Professor
you're
Lama,
muted.
you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Swati Chawla, for really telling us something which has been widely written, but from a very different perspective. You discuss the role of Tibetology Institute in Sikkim. It would be of great interest to discuss this further, precisely because this was one institute which is widely seen as a kind of major interconnections between Tibet and the entire Eastern Himalayas, right? If you go to any of the major research institutes located in Lhasa or even in Sigachi and Ganse, you'll suddenly realize that the people there really look forward today also to see how this Institute of Tibetology could really play a pioneering role as far as bringing two geographies together in terms of their cultural historical past. Very interesting. We'll discuss about it. May I now invite Professor Aniket Alam from the IIIT-Hyderabad to make a presentation. Professor Alam.
Thank you, Professor Lama. I'm just sharing my slides. There you go. I hope you could all see this.
Yes, sir. It's very visible.
It's visible. Shall I continue?
Yeah, please.
Please.
All right. Thank you. So yes, I'm trying to look at oral histories and trying to see how people remembered borders and what people are saying about borders in the Himalayas. So before I do that, let me get back to how borders have been visualized. Professor Lama actually gave a very good idea about how these modern borders appeared. This is how all of us look at it, that the Asian highlands, there was a colonial imposition in the 19th century which brought in lines on the map, often which then were discovered on the ground. These are precise, permanent, impervious. They could change only with discussions at the highest level, and most often not. And the argument has been, put it in a slightly simplified manner, that these new borders disrupted the traditional linkages and connections which made the Himalayas a historical region. And I agree with much of this. In fact, my book, which we'll come to in a little while, does this. But before we come to the 21st century, let's look at about 100 years before. Curzon, his book, which is actually a set of lectures he gave after he went back to England from his viceroyship. It's published as a small book. It's not discussed enough, I think, because it is important, because it brought together a whole century of thinking about how do you define the borders of Asia. And I think in that, it sort of summarized into sort of, what should one say, aligned set of ideas and principles about what the border should be for especially the Asian highlands. And this sort of sense of what borders should be was, I argue, set in stone in a sense for the Himalayas, where the argument was that sovereign states need to politically settle the borders of the Himalayan regions to settle matters politically for themselves, for peace to prevail. So we need India and China and Pakistan, or if we call it internally, so Sikkim and India, or Nepal and India and Bhutan, and etc., etc. We need to settle these borders at the level of the state. There are multiple claims, but the assumption is that these claims are from sovereign states. The legitimate claims are from sovereign states, and the other claims have to be sort of viewed as part. So if people have claims to pastoral runs or trading routes or religious pilgrimages, movements, that has to be entered into this conversation through the sovereign states who are the legitimate actors. Since then, of course, Curzon was not an academic, but I think he set the framework for much of thinking later. Of course, people have looked at it differently. Some of the people who I have gone back to understand how academics have looked at borders in the Asian highlands, particularly the Himalayas and the related mountain networks, people like Owen Latimore, Alistair Lamb, who both of these are scholars are not sort of spoken about too much, but I think they're still pretty relevant in what they talked about. But in this century, in the last 20 years, we have had David Gellner, James Scott, of course, but David Gellner more specifically for South Asia. We have coming closer to my area of work, which is the Western Himalayas and the Northwestern area, the mountains there. You have people, Nayanika Mathur's work, which looked at how borders disrupted local societies in Uttarakhand. Benjamin Hopkins' work on the Northwest frontier area, where he talks about frontier governmentality locking people into a sense of barbarity. So this whole border and the ideology of the colonial border creates barbarity and this lack of civilization on the border areas and the areas the border works through. I'm not going to spend too much of time on this because I think most of us are familiar, but I'll engage a little more with Kyle Gardner's work because it speaks closer to me, and I think there's a lot of overlap with what I have been arguing till now. This book, The Frontier Complex, which came out last year, a few years ago, he had this article in, I think, the Historical Journal or wherever. Basically, the argument that Kyle Gardner made was important because it distilled a lot of what was being said in tangents, but he brought it together very coherently and persuasively with a really rich archival resource to back it up, arguing that colonialism actually discovered the watershed as this scientific principle to divide territory in the Himalayas. And this, he argued, was against the traditional ways in which Himalayan societies viewed territorial divisions, these italics are from him, which he says, Himalayan societies had border points, they did not have border lines. And colonialism is what brought in these border lines along these border points, linking these border points through the watershed principle. So the water parting, the highest point is where the border between India and China or Pakistan and Afghanistan or wherever else would be. And he argues that, this was a huge shift from previous ideas of borders where he identifies at least 4 different types. He does this typology of material, cosmological, political, linguistic borders, which overlapped and people worked through them. So in a sense, what is now perhaps a word which people don't like using too much, but a fuzzy border. And that actually brings me to a critique of my own work, which was expressed most elaborately in my book, Becoming India, about how territory got fixed with British rule, how it disrupted the traditional flows of people, animal, goods there, remade regions within the Himalayas. So the burden of argument was colonialism actually remade the Himalayas, these borders remade the Himalayas. And basically, the title of the book was about how the Western Himalayas became India over a century of colonial rule, where these new territories and these new borders played a very important role. Unfortunately, now when I look back, and particularly in the last 2 years, this is something which is emerging, and what I'm presenting here is a work in progress in that sense, is that I think all of these, starting from Curzon on, and some of the other scholars since then have been strongly critical of the colonial position perspective, but I think the error we all made was that we looked at states as the only legitimate historical actors. People are acted upon. And in that sense, I think much of scholarship, even that which has critiqued colonial borders, has remained within the larger framework set by Curzon. And Curzon is this sort of person, I think, who represents the best in that sense of colonial views of border and state making. This started actually changing when I started working in Spiti a few years before this fieldwork I started doing last year. I have been, after my PhD, not been in academics for almost a decade and a half, and I've just got back about 5 years ago. So I've been re-engaging with contemporary history, rather less with colonial history, and in the Satluj Valley, looking at contemporary change, historical change, but to the vantage point of religious practice. There's a lot of interesting research which is happening around this, so I want to sort of place myself there. For my own work, what I did was that over between 2018 and 2020, I had identified 6 to 8 religious sites, a bunch of them in the Ani subdivision of the Kullu district, which faces the Satluj Valley and not the Bias Valley. The temples of Shamshir and Khudijal and Jogeshwar, Mahadev. Also identified some places in Kinnor, which is the Chamunda Devi temple of Koti, the Dablashu of Kanam, the Taranda Devi at Bhaba, but also perhaps 2 other sites which I'm still not sure of. The lockdown and COVID created a lot of disruption for my fieldwork. I also base myself, what I'm presenting here, on earlier works which I did on monasteries in Spiti in 2018 and 20. These are the people I'm drawing on here. I, of course, messed up my timings and all that. I thought I will be able to give a lot of quotations. I'm just going to summarize stuff from what people had said. The first set of 4 people are from Kinnor. The second set of 2 people are from the Ani Valley, and the bottom set are people from Hudling, which is the border between Kinnor and Spiti. It's a new village which was created after the border came up at Korik, the India-China border. And this fieldwork actually we were looking not at borders, we were looking at religious institutions and how they are changing, but this actually constantly brought up the issue of borders, divisions between territories, religious or whatever else, economic, political, village level, etc. And what we realized was that oral traditions refer to precise borders. Borders are not necessarily borderlands. They are not just frontiers, large swaths of land. That too, but very often borders refer to extremely precise lines. They are not just border points, they are lines which people know how they go between points. And I think this got me a sense that we are making a mistake when we assume that traditional ideas of spatial division lack some sort of precision, particularly thinking in terms of linear borders. There are a variety of ways in which territory and geographical space was sliced. I agree. Some of them are not precise. Many are. And I think we know that, for example, historically borders and spaces and regions change, but the fact that they move, territories move, borders move, does not mean that people do not work with clear lines on the ground. Often they do, often these are extremely important in how communities and economies and religious geographies are visualized and worked over the historical period. And I would like to look at two particular borderlines that have constantly come up when we are talking to people. One is what in Himachal Pradesh is called the Dhar. For those who are not there from that area, you would, just to tell you that this is the ridge line along the mountain top, which you would typically see from the village at the top. And this is often this ridge line, and it is extremely precise that, that tree there to that boulder there to that spring there. These are divisions between waters, between pasture grounds, between deities, and thus very often we find these are also political borders, powers. Who exercises power over nature, over people, over each other? Who has legitimacy? Which deity then has the right to adjudicate, etc., etc. And these are often extremely precise, that this happened here and not, say, if you look at it visually, 50 meters away, because that is on the other side of the Dhar, and that is not the area of power of the deity or the state that which it belonged to. And then if you look at it, and we particularly looked at one of these crossings, if you think of the passes as crossings, this of course presupposes the idea of a precise border, and not just as a point. Between these laws, people have very vivid ideas of lines which demarcate, which link these 2 points. Similarly, with what is again in the Shimla district and in Kullu and Kinnaur called the Nala, which is, streams and rivers are borders, but small streams, springs which go down as really small streams which can be just jumped across. These often form divisions between villages, between deities, between travel routes, between pasture lands.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. You have 3 minutes left. Thank you.
Right. So we have divisions between Kanam and Labrang. These are the 2 villages, a very small stream which can be easily crossed. But old divisions, the political and religious affiliations are very different. We looked at, for example, the customs house which was built at Namgyal on the Bushar-Guge border, which is now the Shiptela post. We looked at the coming of the Dabla deities to Guge, from Guge to Kinnaur, there are 8 deities. And in all of these cases, the border is seen as very precise. There are 8 brothers and 1 sister. All these deities, these 9 deities, have very precise divisions among them. Pastoral runs, again, the fights are often very on the fact that very precise border lines are crossed. And before I conclude, I just want to talk about needing to look at another resource, which again, I realize we have in a sense forgotten. This is Lucien Febvre and his great idea of political soil and economic soil. And for those who have read this book, it's interesting that he uses Tibet as a place to talk about the political soil and the economic soil, who come together to define the historical region, which is through an interaction of geography, of people, of goods, engaging with each other in historical time, which creates the historical region. And I think this is a good resource for us to go back and think through about how traditionally borders were looked at, both as fuzzy but also as precise. And the fact that, Febvre talks about borders as generative regions for historical society. So of course, modern borders are imposed, but they are successful only if adapted and adopted by the people. And this area we are studying in, we find that people have used these borders to remake their lives. The borders are resources to work out new circuits of journeys for people, animals, goods. roads and crossroads, build new networks and hubs. They recreate religious and economic geography. They build new political and social identities. It's a regenerative process. It's perhaps can be viewed in through the perspective of an invention of tradition. So I would like to conclude by saying that modern scholarship, in an attempt to critique colonial constructions of borders, has perhaps essentialized the modern border as only destructive. Our research, and particularly looking at oral history, suggests that people are agents of history who work with borders, who have a sense of precise borders, who have a sense of borders which are impervious. And they manage to rework themselves, recreate themselves in ways which are quite surprising. And I think what has happened over the last few decades is that we have had this theory in hand and we have gone searching for evidence to fit it. Perhaps my work suggests that it's a call for a moment of pause. We need to rethink of people, how do they build borders? And perhaps people did not work with borders in the Northwest frontier, in Kashmir, in other places, but in Himachal, they did. And the borders are peaceful because of that. So I'll end here, and I look forward to questions and comments from all the wonderful participants here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alam. Very interesting presentation. I think we will have quite a few points to discuss about what you have said, particularly on the oral history part of it, and of course, how institutions have evolved. When we were preparing a report for the government to reopen the trade route between Tibet, Autonomous Region, and Sikkim, we did a lot of oral history exercise. And one of the things which we really wanted to check was what really came first. Was it pilgrimage or trade? Because a lot of literature say that they ran parallel, they built each other, supported each other, but we actually wanted to know who actually found the routes, because we found very powerful traders, right? And a lot of institutions all across the Himalayas which came up during the last 3-4 centuries. The oral history is very important, particularly for the mountain areas. We have sources like missionaries going there, coming back and writing. We have expeditioners, like Nain Singh, Allah Muhammad, Ugen Gatso, Kintup Lama, Hariram, Chibu Lama. They were all the people who worked for the Surveyor Generals, and they came back with absolutely brilliant accounts of what they really witnessed and recorded it. But we have a whole lot of unwritten, undocumented oral literature, right? And over the last 4 generations, 5 generations, 10 generations, all of them have gradually eroded. So whatever little we are left with as far as mountain literature is concerned, I think they are in the form of religious scripts. Particularly, so if someone could really look into it, right, and see what they really thought about environment, what they really thought about cross-border cultural intercourses, right? And that's what we tried in Sikkim University. We had a very solid wing in Sikkim University to undertake a range of oral history projects. I think that's very, very critical. So I think we should go to the third speaker, but may I now request the third and the fourth speakers? Sorry, you might have to limit yourselves to exactly 18 minutes because we would like to devote some time for discussing some of the presentations also. So may I now invite Professor Sanjukta Datta, from Ashoka University to make his presentations.
Thank you, Professor Lama. I
Yes.
would also...
Sorry. I said to make his presentations, to make her presentation. Sorry. Thank you.
Not at all. We are talking about fluid identities.
Yes, thank you.
Across and beyond the Himalayas. And I would also like to thank my colleague Swargajyoti Gohai for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Why do I want to thank her is because I think the chronological spectrum of my presentation is vastly different from that of the other co-panelists. But I hope to demonstrate that at least connected geographies and cultural interfaces across the Himalayas go back to a period into the pre-modern, so well beyond the colonial and the contemporary, of course. So ancient Magadha, or the region that corresponds to the southern part of the state of Bihar in India today, formed part of the sacred geography of Buddhism right from its inception in the 6th-5th century BCE. For about 2 millennia, that is until about 15th century, Magadha was the focus of an almost unbroken history of Buddhist worship by either attracting pilgrim devotees from near and far to the many temples and monasteries, the viharas, that came to define its sacred landscape, or, and I think this is very important, or by getting parts of its sacred topography transposed onto places in East and Southeast Asia. In this rather brief presentation, I explore Magadha's trans-Himalayan networks with a special focus on 2 sites, Mahabodhi, which is modern Bodh Gaya, and Nalanda, whose characters were markedly different from each other, but which were both distinguished by their sustained linkages with the pre-modern Asian Buddhist world. Mahabodhi, as many of you know, was believed to be the place where the founder of the faith had attained enlightenment, seated under a sacred fig tree, which has come to be known as the Bodhi tree, and it was included in the earliest pilgrimage circuit connecting the sites where 4 defining life events of the Buddha had occurred: his birth, enlightenment, first sermon, and death. And sanctioned, the pilgrimage circuit was sanctioned no less by the Buddha himself. Nalanda, on the other hand, derives its reputation from a mega monastery, a Mahavihar. This is how Nalanda defines itself according to its own inscriptions. That was established here probably around the 5th century, and which soon evolved into a highly regarded center of Buddhist learning. On the basis of my analysis of a combination of textual, inscriptional, and art historical material, I demonstrate how the history of Magadha's networks beyond the Himalayan regions can be broken down into 2 distinct phases. The first covers the period between the 5th and the 7th centuries CE, and the second lasts between the 7th and the 15th centuries CE. So covering this entire millennium with certain landmarks that I'm going to talk about. In the first phase, this is when the oldest surviving images of the landscape, so memorialization at Mahabodhi and Nalanda, date from the period between the 5th and the 7th centuries, almost exclusively derived from the travel accounts of Chinese scholar monks, again, very well known to this audience, such as Fajian, Xuanzang, and Aitsing, who traveled through harsh terrains to experience the land where the Buddha himself had trod, learn from Buddhist masters, collect manuscripts of foundational texts, and relics of the Buddha. For instance, that Nalanda by the mid-7th century already had a rich built history resulting from royal patronage of imperial powers, such as the Gupta kings of north-central India, is attested for the first time by Xuanzang's account. However, scholars need to be careful about using Xuanzang's account as a guide map for locating Nalanda's many temples and vihars. M.B. Rajni's analysis of satellite imagery of the excavated remains has established that Xuanzang's confident layout of the site does not match the architectural remnants at the site today. In the case of Mahabodhi, it is known that sometime in the early centuries CE, the locus of worship shifted from the Bodhi tree to a monumental structural temple whose nucleus most likely was established by the 3rd century BCE Maurya Emperor Ashoka. It has been impossible to fix a firm date for the building of the structural temple, but the lack of a reference to any freestanding temple in Faxian's account, but its detailed description in Xuanzang's account proves that the temple was built sometimes definitely before the 7th century. What both Faxian's and Xuanzang's account record is that Mahabodhi was considered to be a site of unmatched sacrality, connected to the enlightenment of the Buddhas of the past, present, and future. It is from the 7th century travelogues of Xuanzang and Aitsing, for instance, that one learns that the image enshrined in the Mahabodhi temple was a divine creation, something that had to be witnessed during their travels to the Western region, and that imitations of it had been made frequently. What is the image like? What was it like is important because we'll find references to it a few minutes later again. It depicted the Buddha seated cross-legged with his hands in the Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, or the gesture of touching the earth, recalling the moment when he had attained his enlightenment and asked the earth to bear witness to this moment. Moving on then to the second phase, if you remember, 7th to the 15th. So there is a slight overlap between the first and the second, but let's see how the second distinguishes itself from the first. Magadha witnessed the highest trans-regional pilgrim traffic between the 11th and the 13th centuries. At Mahabodhi, this is borne out by the discovery of inscriptions written not only in Sanskrit, but also in Chinese and Tibetan, which gives Mahabodhi a unique position in the epigraphic history of pre-modern India. So what was the nature of this trans-regional connections during these centuries? This was the time when Burmese kings sent 2 missions to repair or restore the Mahabodhi temple. Chinese monks on 4 separate occasions either set up stone stupas or donated monastic robes woven with golden threads, described as kashayas in the inscriptions, to be hung over the throne of the Buddha. A Chinese emperor and empress, no less, of the Song dynasty deputed a monk to set up a stupa in memory of a deceased emperor right next to the spot where the Buddha is believed to have attained enlightenment. And 6 lay donors from Tibet undertook a pilgrimage to set right the influence of an inauspicious constellation in their lives. Between the late 10th and the 13th centuries, there was an efflorescence of a cult around the ritualized worship of books in Buddhist monasteries of the Bihar-Bengal region. Although written texts had always been considered sacred in the Buddhist tradition, for being embodiments of the Buddha's dharma, their potency now came to approximate that of sacred objects such as stupas and images. The 3 Mahayana texts which were frequently represented in Eastern Indian illustrated manuscripts included Pragyaparamita, Karanda Vyuha, and Pancharaksha Sutras. Individual patrons commissioned such manuscripts in order to gain spiritual merit, punya, and possibly gifted them to large monasteries where they might have served as visual aids for meditating monks. For the large part of the history of Eastern Indian Buddhist book cult, sacred books were produced in big Buddhist monasteries, especially in and around Nalanda. Of the surviving specimens whose provenance is known, the maximum number can be traced to Nalanda, and the monastic center emerged as what the art historian John Guy describes as the parent atelier of the illustrated manuscript tradition. Art historian Jina Kim's research strongly suggests that the influx of lay and monastic Buddhists from Nepal and Tibet might have been the possible impetus for the practice of illuminating the folios of a Buddhist manuscript in Eastern Indian monastic centers during the first half of the 11th century. She argues that it is as if the production of illustrated manuscripts began mainly as an export-oriented business, and domestic demands grew as laymen and laywomen of high social status caught up with the trend. Her thesis seems to be logical, since the production of illustrated Buddhist manuscripts was on the rise in the early 11th century and increased dramatically by the 13th century in the Kathmandu Valley, Nepal. The similarity in the use of palm leaf as the main material of choice, as well as the similarity in format and size, put the Nepalese and Eastern Indian illustrated manuscripts in the same tradition of bookmaking, despite their stylistic, iconographic, and sometimes even paleographic differences. Just to give one example, See, the second oldest surviving illustrated manuscript from Nalanda, which is now in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, was a manuscript of the Ashtasahasrika Pragya Paramita, which was commissioned by a Nepalese lay donor named Ramajiva. Similarly, the donor of the earliest surviving manuscript of this text, which is now preserved in the Asiatic Society, Calcutta, is identified as a monastic elder or sthavira named Sadhu Gupta, whose unique title, Shakyacharya, raises the tantalizing possibility that his monastery, one Tadivadi Mahavihar, might have been located in Nepal. Right? Shifting gears. Now, Bodh Gaya was probably the only site in the ancient Buddhist world whose unparalleled sacredness generated a culture of replication in art and architecture in which Southeast Asia, China, Tibet, and Nepal were major participants from roughly after the 10th century. Different types of reproductions selectively portrayed elements exclusively associated with the site. For example, miniature Vajrasan Buddha images, Vajrasan being the term referred by which Mahabodhi was referred to. So the image enshrined within the Mahabodhi temple at Bodh Gaya. Miniature Vajrasan Buddha images in stone, wood, and cloth represented the main icon once enshrined within the Mahabodhi temple. Small-scale temple models in stone and wood displayed the architecture of the temple, with the Bodhi tree emerging from the back of the terrace. Molded and low-fired terracotta plaques highlighted the Buddha image inside the temple with a signature pyramidal spire against the background of the Bodhi tree. And finally, full-scale copies of the Mahabodhi temple in Southeast Asia replicated its architectural form, with the most elaborate versions approximating the original temple complex. So not just the dominating influence of the temple, the structural temple, but the entire sacred landscape at Mahabodhi. Let me take the case study of Tibet to examine how Mahabodhi was reimagined in the Asian Buddhist world. From a rich pool of possible types of recreations, Tibetans chose miniature models of the Mahabodhi temple or the temple complex and sculpted images of the Vajrasana Buddha to transpose the sacred Magadhan terrain onto this land. Both kinds of portable reproductions appear to have originated in the region around Gaya and Bodh Gaya in Magadha, today's South Bihar, between about the 9th and the 12th century, from where they were dispersed, most likely via pilgrims to Tibet, Nepal, and Myanmar, places which went on to generate inspired recreations of their own. The dozen-odd published miniature temple models found from Tibet, which are stylistically dated between the 10th and the 13th centuries, are in stone or sandalwood and are usually very small, so less than 20 centimeters high. Irrespective of their material and size, the individual models of the temple display a flexible combination of elements from among the typical features of the Mahabodhi temple. So anyone looking at these models today will be able to trace their origin to the Mahabodhi temple of Bodh Gaya. The pyramidal tower, 4 small replica towers at the corners of the terrace, and the characteristic Bodhi tree on a projection of the western terrace. In Tibet, such miniature 3-dimensional Mahabodhi temple models were unmistakably objects of worship. Perhaps the miniature Mahabodhi models function somewhat like the portable Tibetan shrine Gau, which carries one's tutelary deity or idam. In the Vajrayana understanding of holy sites, the locus of meditation could be simultaneously located in cosmic space, in the geographical world, within the human body, and symbolized in the form of a mandala, a cosmogram. Perhaps these models then served as 3-dimensional mandalas, as has been suggested by the art historian John Guy, who I referred to earlier in another context. And if so, one wonders if it is reasonable to argue that since the Tibetan Vajrayana practitioner had access to individual Vajrasans as sites of meditation, this did away with the necessity of constructing a large-scale replica of the Mahabodhi temple in the years when pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya had been halted. Among members of the Asian Buddhist world with sustained interactions with Mahabodhi, Tibet and Sri Lanka are conspicuous by the absence of full-scale copies of the Mahabodhi temple. Supplementing the miniature temple replicas in recreating an association with Mahabodhi in Tibet was a group of small metal images, again about less than 15 centimeters high, which were reproductions of the Vajrasan Buddha image, the form in which it was enshrined inside the Mahabodhi temple by a conservative estimate sometime between the 9th and the 13th centuries. The distinguishing features of this image type include the use of two separate metals for the Buddha's body and his robe, his short neck, the Buddha's cross-legged seated posture, the placement of his right hand in the earth-touching gesture, and a distinctive style of his robe. One brief example before I conclude. As a famous image type in the Asian Buddhist world, the Mahabodhi image, or the Vajrasan image of the Buddha seated cross-legged in the earth-touching gesture, was introduced in China in the mid-7th century, appearing on a large number of molded clay tablets found near the large wild goose pagoda in the Chen monastery complex that interestingly served as a center for Xuanzang's translation activities in the 7th century, as well as a few other locations in the Tang capital, Chang'an. By the end of the 7th century, large reliefs and statues of this image type began to be made in the Tang capitals of Chang'an and Luang and in the cave temple sites in Sichuan. What is most noteworthy is that they were identified on the basis of label inscriptions as
Sorry
being...
to interrupt, ma'am. You have 3 minutes left.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
definitely conclude by then. What is most noteworthy is that they were identified on the basis of label inscriptions as being copies on the auspicious image of the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment. One of the special features of the sculptural commemoration of the Buddha's enlightenment in China was that it was a hybrid form that combined two iconographic types, one identified as the Bodh Gaya prototype that we've discussed at length, and the other, which was unique to China, the bejeweled Buddha, or the practice of portraying the Buddha with crown and armlets. A full-scale recreation of the Mahabodhi temple was made in Beijing in China in the 15th century, and Shariputra, the last known abbot of Mahabodhi Mahavihar, had an important role in its creation. Between the early 13th and the 18th centuries, 7 large-scale recreations of the Mahabodhi temple came to be formed in Myanmar, Thailand, Nepal, and China. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Absolutely a brilliant presentation. I think you have revealed some of the, both the architectural practices and, of course, the evolution of how interactions really develop. If you just follow the path that was actually walked through by Guru Padmasambhava, and what he did along these routes, right, both in India, neighboring countries, and in Tibet, and what he really, how he brought the communities, how he interconnected the communities through the means of promoting Buddhism, was exactly what you have said in terms of there an individual is involved, here an institution like Mahabodhi Society is involved. There is very interesting literature written by some of the very well-known Sri Lankan scholars on Mahabodhi Society, right, and how Sri Lankans actually got into this entire networking. I think that would be worth examining. So the last speaker today would be Professor Swargajyoti Gohain from Ashoka University. Please.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, ma'am, you're audible.
Right. Can you share my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Yes, yes, very much. Yes.
Oh, okay. So in this paper, I'm basically going to continue a theme that Swati has already talked about from a historical perspective, and I'm going to give a
Professor Goin,
yes.
why don't you make it a full screen? Would
Okay.
Nishant, could you please do this?
We have a technical team.
Ma'am, please press F5.
No, Nishant would do that, please. Nishant, just do.
I'm sorry, but the screen is not shared by me, so ma'am would
No.
have to do it. Yeah.
How do
Okay.
Ma'am, this is Shubhadeep. I'm from the technical side. Please try pressing F5. It would work.
Okay, I've just sent a slide to you because it's
Okay,
not-
ma'am. Then
yeah.
we would share from our side.
Yeah. So sorry for the delay. I'm going to continue a theme that Dr. Swati Chawla has already talked about the Tibetan Buddhist educational institutions. And while she talked about the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology, I'm going to focus on the other three institutes which are in Ladakh, Sarnath, and a newer one in Arunachal Pradesh. So basically what I'm going to talk about in this paper is to show how the Tibetan Buddhist populations in the borderlands of India are co-opted into a Himalayan cultural network through these institutional spaces of Buddhist higher learning. I'm waiting to see if the PPT can be shared.
Ma'am, we haven't received the file yet. Have you sent it to the AICC's ID?
Yes, I did. Okay. So I have to press F what? F5, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
ma'am.
I am sharing F5.
What you could do, ma'am, is go to the slideshow option, and then you may present it from there. I believe F5 works for Windows desktops, and it seems that you're using Mac. So if you could just full screen
It's this little button next to the horizontal navigation bar. Yeah, that button.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That would work.
Okay. Sorry about
That's
all
great,
this.
yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so post 1959 and the reconstitution of a Tibetan diasporic community in India, important monastic universities were displaced from Tibet and rebuilt in India. Not only have they been engaged in preserving and promoting Tibetan Buddhist traditions among the diasporic Tibetans, but uniquely modern institutes like the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies at Sarnath, which was established in 1967, or the Central Institute of Buddhist Studies in Ladakh, and most recent Central Institute of Himalayan Cultural Studies in Arunachal Pradesh, they combine a very modern knowledge with Buddhism-based curriculum, and they also admit non-Tibetan but Buddhist populations. So while scholars have focused on the reinvention of Buddhism in India through analysis of Buddhist sites and universities such as Bodh Gaya and Nalanda, and the reconstruction of Tibetan diasporic monastic spaces in southern India, such as George Dreyfus, and then there are scholars who have investigated the relations between Buddhism and market. What I am interested in doing is to look at these educational institutions as a means of enabling contact and connect between monasteries and a wider public, and not just the local laity in the contemporary context. So these education institutions form the outreach network in the contemporary context for monasteries. So earlier, monasteries were seen to represent what has been called monastic geographicity by Wim van Spengen. So this term, monastic geographicity, gestures simultaneously at the architectural markers of stability, that is the monasteries themselves, while also invoking the mobility set by routes between towns. People, commodities, and ideas moved in a complex calendar over extensive terrain dotted by monastic residences. Nomads, peasants, pastoralists, monks, novices, lay households, exchanged goods, grain, ideas, and ritual practices at and around these monastic nodes. So monastic geographicity was also, it also marked sacred geography. Indrani Chatterjee then defines monastic geographicity as a network of monasteries, themselves embedded in various pastoral, military, trade, and pilgrimage ties. Anchored by their possession of land, livestock, trade rights, and capital, these monastery networks, composed of assemblages of monk, laity, and non-human lives, exercised immense social, cultural, and territorial influence until colonial rule disrupted these networks. So I use the word new monastic geographicity to look at the new networks that are coming up today, and I center these networks in the educational institutions. So I asked this question: what makes the Buddhist monasteries network institutes? And my research investigates the role of educational institutions as nodes in this kind of new monastic geographicity. My research methods, and it's a very much a work in progress. So I've visited Ladakh, I visited Arunachal Pradesh, and I also have conducted during the pandemic period online interviews with the VC of CIHTS in Sarnath. And I've also spoken to current teachers and staff and students, as well as former current students and teachers and staff. And I've also tried to collect some documents to get the institutional histories from the field. So what was the purpose of all these institutes which came up? And Swati has already gone into some of the historical detail, where she's nicely woven the security context into it. What the mission statement of CIHTS in Sarnath contains is that there was this objective, and a lot of writings about it too, that there was an objective of trying to provide alternative source of education and cultural preservation for those mostly monks who were displaced from Tibet and no longer had access to the previous institutes of higher learning. And now we find that CIHTS offers degree programs in all academic disciplines, which Buddhist studies and Tibetan medicine. And from 2017, CIHTS has also started offering master's degrees in Tibetan language. So this is a kind of, curriculum that is followed in the other two institutes as well, which is CIBS and CIHCS. So this is a kind of, standard curriculum that's followed in all these three institutes, which I'm focusing on. And a former student also, who's now a current faculty at CIBS, also gave me a more detailed descriptions of the kind of works that they were trained in as students. So all students who joined these universities and had to study Buddhist philosophy and history of Tibetan Buddhism. So this is a map of the CIHCS, which is a newer institute, which was started in 2003. It was conceptualized in 2003, and in 2010, it became a Government of India institute. Earlier, it was run mostly by a non-governmental organization called the Buddhist Culture Preservation Society, which is in Arunachal Pradesh. And the Buddhist Culture Preservation Society was also a very interesting, it's got a very interesting history, because it was founded by the late Sona Gonse Rinpoche, who unfortunately met a very sudden death in 2014. But before his demise, he was very active and very dynamic leader. He was a monk who was also a politician, and he revived many monasteries, many Buddhist institutions, many Buddhist sacred spaces in Arunachal Pradesh. He was also an office bearer in many Buddhist pan-Indian Buddhist organizations. And it was because of him that this institute was also started. And the story goes that he went and he wanted to, get funding and recognition, and he succeeded. And when he started this organization, he asked a friend of his, Lama Tashi, who had already actually gained fame as a Buddhist chant master. And he asked Lama Tashi to come and be the principal of this very new institute. And I was there when this institute was at this formative stage, when they were recruiting teachers as well as students. So I've seen how it has also grown in the last 10, 12 years. And in 2022, when I again went back to this institute and did more interviews there, I met the current director, who's from Leh, Ladakh, Gurmeet Georgie, and he told me that now there are, further efforts to try and get recognition for this university to become a deemed university and to develop 5 academic faculties such as ancient Indian and Buddhist studies and language and Tibetan medicine, Himalayan craft, and also modern social sciences. So the Buddhist Culture Preservation Society is still very much involved in the in overseeing activities there. There is a lot of connection and networking happening between the monasteries in this area and with the CIHCS personal exchange, and many people who are trained in the monasteries, especially in Tibetan language or Bhoti language as it is known in India. So many of the monks in the monasteries go and become teachers in CIHCS. So we see this kind of personal exchange as well as many other collaboration in activities which are happening. So the field work that I did showed these kinds of connections that exist between the monasteries and the educational institutions, the higher education institutions like CIBS, as well as Ladakh. And in Ladakh, this connection between monasteries and educational institutions is even starker. So there are also this is a picture of the Garden Rabgiling Monastery, which was one of the structures which was rebuilt by the late Zona Gonsa Rinpoche. And the connection between the establishment of the monastery and then the monastery schools and then other feeder schools which also train young children in Buddhist studies, who then become the people, the students who later join the higher education institutions. So there is a connection, you can see or you can observe throughout, which is this flow of people, of students, of teachers among these different institutes. Here you can see a picture of the Shantideva Vidyalaya, which is also feeder school, and you'll see similar feeder schools in Ladakh. So there is a common pattern that was observed, that is observable. So what is the context? The context is that the monasteries, as many people have already written about, they've always been dependent on lay patronage, especially the practice of dana, in which the lay population provided what the clergy needs, like food, clothing, land, and in exchange for dana, the monks would organize rituals, prayers, or and in the modern context, you also have a lot of patronage for various household affairs. So this kind of dependence on the laity has changed now. It has become more of a formalized system where you see lots of sponsorship systems or fundraising plans. Now monasteries also publish brochures inviting international donations, and so you see that there is a kind of transformation happening in terms of the monk and laity relations, and the recruitment of monasteries are also declining because not many people send their children to monasteries. There are also now newer avenues for cultural preservation. So how do you sustain the outreach for monasteries? And what I'm trying to argue through the ethnographic work that I've done is that this outreach is now made possible through these new institutional networks which connect the monasteries with Buddhist educational institutions in the Himalayan borderlands. So what I'm interested also is to look at how the Indian Himalayan Buddhists, that means the people in Arunachal Pradesh, in Ladakh, in Sikkim, Himachal Pradesh, how there is a redrawing of boundaries of identity, of belonging for the Indian Himalayan Buddhists. And I've written about this already in an article which got published earlier this year about new kinds of organizations such as the Himalayan Buddhist Cultural Association and the Indian Himalayan Council for Nalanda Buddhist Traditions, where Buddhism and there's a melding of a Buddhist identity and an Indian identity. So that kind of co-option of Buddhism into an Indian identity, how that has become even more noticeable through the activities of organizations such as the Indian Himalayan Council of Nalanda Buddhist Traditions. And what I'm trying to see is that it is also now being facilitated by these educational institutions that I just talked about. So there is a kind of re-territorialization happening where people who have now lost connections to the earlier center of Tibet are now regrouping and re-territorializing, forming new networks, and these networks can be seen in these educational institutions. And it is also a network which is facilitated by the Indian state. And I think Swati's talk also gives a sense of how this was done through a historical perspective. When Swati talked about the inauguration of the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology involving both Nehru and the Dalai Lama. So it is also a network in which the Indian state's presence is very much seen. So yeah, I think I will conclude here. I was also accounting for 10 to 12 minutes. I think this is where I will stop now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Swargajyoti Quine. Very interesting presentation. When you are presenting about what Sarnath institution is doing, what institute in Ladakh is doing, I see similar kind of countervailing accents, I will say, because these are not very natural actions are taking place on the other side of the border. That's in China. If you have watched what has happened in China in the last 10 to 15 years, there's a plethora of institutions that have come up to study Buddhism in Tibet and Buddhism at large, right? And there are, again, a chain of institutions that are working on various aspects of Himalayan regions. So a major theme of research in China among the critical mass of scholars is, of course, Buddhism and the Himalayan regions. And they are integrating, in order to make it much more comprehensive, they are integrating, say, for example, traditional medicinal systems among the Tibetans with the mainstream Chinese traditional medicine systems. So you find a deeper integrations. Whereas I find in India, our efforts, of course, we are the core center for Tibetan studies and Himalayan and the Buddhism studies in South Asia, of course. But even then, I find there is some kind of a very scattered management of both Buddhism and Himalayan studies, right? I don't find a single institution in India. We have GB Pant and all these institutions, but they don't look at the entire Himalayan regions from a very comprehensive, interconnected perspective. So they would look at it purely from scientific, botanical, geological perspective, right? We don't have an institute. So one of the factors which we have to really consider is when we are doing this kind of studies, we must take into consideration what is happening on the other side of the border, right? And that would make us, that would make this entire studies very interesting. So for example, I find I'm at a loss to say that 40 years back, most of the radio all India radio stations located in the Himalayan regions will have a large number of, experts, large number of broadcast journalists located in the institutes, basically to study the mountain areas. So they would report, they would study, they would invite guests and all. Like in Kursion in Darjeeling, there would, I think, more than 15 to 20 Tibetan broadcast journalists. Today, you will find none. So on the one hand, you are demolishing the institutions that really connected with the Himalayas and the Tibetan Buddhism and all. On the other hand, you are building some of the new set of institutions. I happen to review the activities of the Sarnath from in a team in University Grants Commission. And I found Sarnath Institute is so rich as far as knowledge generations, as far as knowledge documentations and all concerned. But there is no connections between what Sarnath is doing and what an institution like JNU or Banaras Hindu University or even institute, there's absolutely no connections, right? So no exchanges, no knowledge sharing. Therefore, I think we have to really give a new orientations as far as the orientations to the entire approach to really understanding the Himalayan regions and, of course, the religious aspects of it. We have about 12 minutes, and I would like to open this forum for questions, and of course, responses would be given by these panelists. Quick questions.
Yes, sir. So we have 5 questions in the chat box as of now. 3 of them are addressed to Professor Swati Chawla, 1 to Professor Aniket, and 1 to Professor Swargjyoti.
Great.
So we
Yes.
could go in 2 sets. We could address the 3 questions to Professor Swati Chawla first, with your permission.
Thank you. And thank you for the 3 questions. I don't want to take all the time. I'm sure there are questions for the other 2 speakers as well. So I think first, Svatasiddha's question, thank you for that. And I actually see this more as an invitation to think more deeply than just as a question. I hadn't thought about, the Scotian perspective that you mentioned. I was in fact thinking about this more in terms of the birth of the nation states, like through a historian's perspective. So I was thinking about like Hobsbawm and Gellner and the very traditional trappings of nation state, founding a printing press, national anthem, national flag. All of these are coterminous with the establishment of the NIT. So I actually think about, I'm taking it as an invitation, and I'm going to think some more and get back to you. The question on Rumtek, I think that will take us in a very different direction, because it's not so much about the establishment of an institute for Tibetan studies, but as a contested monastic space. And, and then of course it gets to the question of the position of the Karmapa within Sikkim and, government of India, government of Sikkim. So I don't know if I want to talk about that yet. The third question, which is about Indira Gandhi and Nehru, definitely the archival record shows, as you correctly point out, there is a marked change, between the two. In fact, the governors or the Indian appointees, and later post the incorporation of Sikkim, the governors have a very different attitude to Sikkim, and where the NIT is within that. I can't speak specifically to that question, but what I can say is that, there is reduced funding, there is definitely reduced patronage, especially post the 1966 article that I had brought up, and this questioning of what is the role of the NIT and how can, or I think maybe it'll be more correct to say the government of India becomes more wary post 1966 and the publication of the article, and definitely under Indira Gandhi, there is a marked change. The other reason for that change could be that the first few appointees in Sikkim, for example, Rustamji, had personal relationships with the Chogyal. So as I mentioned, Rustamji was batchmates with Palden Thondup Namgyal, Jigme Palden Dorji, whose family held the hereditary position of the Prime Minister of Bhutan, was also among the batchmates. B.S. Lal, another Indian appointee in Sikkim, was also in that 1941 ICS batch. So what you see later is also these connections begin to, they get frayed, and there isn't that that sympathy or that personal sort of relationship, with the Sikkimese royal family in the later years. So thank you for this, and I'll now leave it to the others because I'm sure there are questions for them.
Please go ahead.
There is one question for Professor Aniket Alam from Anurag Khond. Thank you for bringing such a unique take on the idea of borders in the context of your understanding of borders as not being necessarily in the form of fixed lines, but also formed through oral traditions. How would you differentiate between a border and a frontier? This is to Professor
So,
Aniket.
a quick response. See, the thing is, the burden of my argument was that traditionally there have been fixed lines. They were not fixed in the sense of trigonometrical precision on a piece of paper, which can be sort of mathematically expanded on the ground or reduced in, not in that sense, but oral traditions actually talk about fixed lines on the territory. They conceive of that. And I think, on the question of differentiating between border and frontier, there are a whole bunch of academic definitions. I do not think there is any consensus among scholars about what exactly is the distinction between border, frontier, boundary, etc., etc. We know that we are talking about historical zones, borderlands, as different from borders and frontiers and boundaries. But I think, I'm not one for right now getting into that thing. I mean, I don't think there's the time or space for this. But I think the burden of my argument was that people did have ideas about precise borders. It wasn't just necessarily borderlands and frontier spaces. I think we need to relook and retrieve that history, hopefully a lot of it through oral histories. That's from me.
Thank you, Professor. We have two questions to Professor Swargjyoti Gohain. The first one is from Professor Sonika Gupta. Do you think that the presence of the Tibetan refugee community in Arunachal is a liability to this process of forging Indian Himalayan solidarity, as organizations like the Mongpa Memang Sopa try to differentiate themselves culturally from the Tibetans? Plus, the presence of conflicts over land between Tibetan refugees and local residents over land. This is the first question. The second is from Anurag Khond. He asks, has the current impasse over the functioning of the Nalanda University has had any effect over the new monastic networks? So these are the two questions to Professor Gohain.
Thank you, Sonika and Anurag. As for the first question, yes, there have been a lot of conflict between Tibetans and local populations, not just in Arunachal Pradesh, but also I think across spaces where there are two populations in the same place, whether it is Himachal Pradesh, whether it is Karnataka. And what seems to be happening here now is that there is an attempt to redraw these boundaries of identity by projecting Buddhist identity. And there have also been articles which have talked about how now Tibetans are also focusing more on Tibetan Buddhism as a way to interact with the world. So rather than talking about the Tibetan national identity, there has been again a redrawing of identity among Tibetans in India too, where they're trying to project their Buddhist identity more than their Tibetan national identity, because that seems to some to be the way forward. And in doing so, when there is a coincidence of these two aims of drawing the boundaries around or along the framework of Buddhism, then these it's possible that instead of conflict, there can be more intersections between different between Tibetan and non-Tibetan Buddhist communities. And the second question about Anurag, from Anurag, is about Nalanda University, and I think that's a very interesting question. There's a Nalanda Mahavihara where you see more intersection between Nalanda Mahavihara and the institutes that I was talking about, like the ones in Sarnath and CIBS and CIHCS in Arunachal Pradesh. And I'm focusing more on those institutes where there is a role of the Tibetan diaspora. Many of these institutes earlier had Tibetans as teachers and as principals, and so I'm looking more at those institutes where the Indian state as well as the Tibetans in exile were coming together, not so much at the Nalanda University. But I'm happy to look at the question that you asked and whether that has had an influence. I don't know yet, but that's not really, Nalanda University has not been a focus, but yeah, I mean, it is something that one can definitely go to get a perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your remarks. We are now running out of time, so I would like to quickly invite Professor Lama for his concluding remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very impressive presentations by all the 4 panel members, Professor Swati Chawla, Professor Aniket, Professor Sanjukta Datta, and Professor Swarajyoti Goen. Thank you very much. And I would like to just make 2 points here. When Professor Swati Chawla mentioned about Hope Cook Namgyal's article in the Tibetology's bulletin in 1966. I think just don't look at the article itself. Look at the larger global context. What was the situations between North and the South? What was the debate going on then between the newly emerging, countries out of the colonial regimes, right? And what were the opposing forces at the global level when the North-South negotiations were taking place, when institutions like NAM, Group of 77, UNCTAD, they were functioning. I think if you bring that debate back to a state like Sikkim, I think, and who are the forces against India at that time, I think you would very definitely get a clue to why that article actually, created so much of eruptions in the Indian political system. So it had a much, much larger global context. My second point to say this is, when you make studies on the Himalayas, I think one of the most critical elements in the entire development, of course, is how Nepal emerged as a kind of a powerful country towards the end of the 18th century, right? And how prior to that, what kind of influences it had in Tibet, including, of course, the entire coins used in Tibet were basically designed in Nepal, were basically minted in Nepal, right? And I think such kind of interconnections made the exchanges and interactions much more, powerful and much more comprehensive. Say, for example, how British India government, right? And prior to that, how they used Christianity. They used technology, including ham radios, to influence to bring the entire Tibet, the monastic classes into confidence. That's altogether a very different story, but very, very interesting to note. So I would like to thank all the panelists, all the participants, and more importantly, ICS and IIT and other team members who brought us together to such a beautiful gathering. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lama. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So with this, we come to an end of the morning session of the day 2 of 15th AICCS. On behalf of ICS, I thank all the speakers for their rich expositions. A special thanks to the chair for constructively engaging all speakers, and a big thanks to the participants for so attentively engaging with this session. The recording of this session will be available on YouTube, and now we will be taking a short break. We will be back at 2 p.m. and the same login details will be valid for the remaining sessions of the day. Thank you, everyone. With this, we end the morning session.
Thank you,
very much.
Nishant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sanjukta, Aniket. Hi, Sanjukta.